All right, this video is about price control. So price controls is module 8 in your book. And price controls basically happen when the government gets involved because equilibrium is determined to be not fair. Okay, so there's basically two options with price controls. You can have a price ceiling or a price floor. So we're going to start with a ceiling. So price ceiling, by definition, is the maximum legal price that can be charged for a product. So just like the ceiling in the room, you can't go any higher than the ceiling. Okay, so we're trying to keep the price below that. Best if I give you an example. So best example of this is when we're talking about apartments. Now we're talking about apartments in very, very large cities. So I'm talking about apartments in New York and Seattle and San Francisco. And in these apartments, in these cities, most people live in apartments because obviously it's going to be cheaper, as well as they just don't have the room for like actual houses. So just like everything else, there's a supply and demand for apartments. So I drew this lovely graph. There's a supply of apartments, there's demand for apartments, and equilibrium is determined. That should be what the price of apartments is. So it's something like $1,200 a month rent for a crappy studio apartment. Remember, a studio apartment is one that does not actually have a bedroom. It's like one room. That's your living room and your bedroom and your dining room all mixed together, right? So $1,200 a month rent is way too high. People can't afford that. So people demand and ask for some help. I mean, people can't afford that to live in the city. So they're going to ask the government for help, and they're going to get involved, and they're going to ask for some price ceilings or rent control. And so what they're going to do is they're going to set the ceiling. Where are they going to set the ceiling compared to equilibrium? Hopefully you said below, because we already said 1,200 is too high. So we're going to set the ceiling, for example, we'll set the ceiling in this case at $1,000 a month rent. Now, how does the ceiling work? What that means is that you can go anything, you can set rent below, anything below $1,000, okay? But can you reach equilibrium? Because by definition, this is the maximum legal price. You cannot go above $1,000. Is $1,000 a new equilibrium? No, it's not a new equilibrium either, because supply and demand don't meet. Okay, remember, equilibrium is only here where supply and demand meet, and that's not here. So, matter of fact, we know that any price below equilibrium, what's the problem? It's creating a permanent shortage. So it's going to be a shortage of apartments. It's going to be hard to find an apartment. Okay, there's actually an old joke that I saw in an old movie where they're joking about trying to find an apartment in New York City, and the guy that was making the joke in the movie was making the joke that he's like, to make it easier to find an apartment in the city, he says they need to just combine the obituary section and the real estate section. Mr. Smith died of natural causes, leaving behind a wife and 4 grandchildren in a lovely 2-bedroom apartment overlooking the Upper West Side. It was a joke, but also at the same point in time, that's kind of how some people used to go and look for apartments, is, look for vacancies in the obituary section. So, like I said, the example is rent control. That's one example. Obviously, it's in the case of best interest for the consumer. It's keeping the prices low for the consumer. But there are problems and controversies to that. So, first off is that there's controversies of, yeah, there's a shortage of apartments, but you also have problems where you're going to have people are going to spend an exorbitant amount of time trying to look for an apartment. Because there's so few out there, they're going to spend their time and their energy trying to search for an apartment, and slip in the doorman some extra money to get their application to the top. That's ridiculous. Okay. You also are going to find that an inefficient allocation to consumers, where you're going to have some people that are going to get apartments based on a luck or personal connections, people that they know. That's not smart. And you're going to have a black market for apartments. Now, this sounds really weird, but I got an example for you. Have you ever watched the show Friends? Remember Monica's a purple apartment? That wasn't hers. If you ever actually watched the show, they made a joke and reference to it several times throughout the series where they talked about, I think it was like her grandmother's, her aunt's, or somebody's, and nobody so theoretically knew that Monica was living there, and she just took over the lease. That's what we mean by the black market. Okay, she wasn't really supposed to be there, but yet she was. Okay, so that's kind of the issue with price ceilings. All right, so let's talk about the opposite. What about a price floor? So a price floor is the lowest legal price that can be charged for a product. So it's basically the opposite of ceiling. But it doesn't work for the same types of products as price ceilings. So the best example of a price floor actually works with wages. In other words, what we're getting paid to do our job. So in this case, I have to explain the supply and demand a little bit. So in this case, the suppliers, if you think about them that way, is you and me, the people that are actually doing the job and trying to earn a living, right? So just like when we did our supply curve for babysitting, you're much more willing to babysit when the price goes up. Okay, and the demanders, so to speak, in this case, are going to be the employers, the people that you work for. So, for example, with the babysitting thing, these are the parents that are hiring you. Okay, they are much more likely to hire you the lower the price goes. So in this instance, the equilibrium actually determines what the price should be and what you should be paid for your work. So when we're talking about wages here, we're talking about, wages in general for various jobs, okay? So it ends up being something like 15 bucks an hour. And again, there's this public outcry where people are just like, $15 an hour, people can't live off from that. That's so unfair. And so we're going to set up, they ask for a price floor. So where do you suppose we're going to set the price floor? Hopefully you said above equilibrium, because we already said that $5 an hour was too low. Now, I know there's people out there that are like, floors, what? Why is it above equilibrium? It's a floor. Shouldn't it be below? No. If you understand what a floor is, it makes sense. We're trying to prevent people from getting to equilibrium because equilibrium is too low. Okay? But the problem is that since the floor is above equilibrium, what do we know about all the prices above equilibrium? It creates a permanent surplus. And in this case, what is it a surplus of? It's a surplus of workers because, hey, these are all the people. Supply is going to be all the people, for example, that want a babysitting job. Demand is all the parents that are going to be willing to hire you. The difference between them is all the number of people that don't get babysitting jobs. Fill in the blank with whatever job you want. Okay? So obviously, what does this look like? This is minimum wage. Right? So $7.25 is the current minimum wage, which sounds fine and dandy, but there's still controversy behind it. So first off, there's the controversy of that whole, again, wasted resources. You spend so much time trying to go and find a job and money to try and find a job because there's so few jobs out there. Okay, so it's a waste of resources. It's also an inefficient allocation of sales among sellers. What that means is that the seller is willing to go and hire you at a lower price, but they can't because the price floor prevents them to do that. So as a result, they don't hire anybody. Okay? It's also an inefficiently low quality. Producers can only sell what consumers are willing to buy, so the quantity is oftentimes still lower. So the quantity ends up being lower. And there's also that whole idea of the inefficiently high quality. The sellers, in this case, the workers, offer very high quality goods at that high price when consumers would rather have low quality at a low price. What that means is that, in the case of workers, we have people that are out there that, are looking for a job, a minimum wage job, but they're overqualified, right? And hey, we don't need, somebody with a college degree to go and flip a burger, right? So keep that in mind. And the other part is that it also encourages illegal activity. There's a black market here. What does the black market look like there? This is going to be the whole, hey, come over here and I'll pay you under the table. What does that mean? They're just going to pay you in cash because then they don't have to pay you minimum wage. They also don't have to pay taxes as well. Neither do you, which sounds great, but they don't have to pay you minimum wage. And by the way, there's that whole fight for 15. What does that mean? They're trying to move the minimum wage up to $15 an hour. In the city of Seattle, they're already in the process of doing it. They're not quite to 15, but they're slowly raising it. Well, what does that mean? This is moving this red bar further and further up. What happens? Our surplus is going to get bigger, which means we're going to have more and more unemployed people. So not exactly the best idea either. All right, that's it for price controls. Please let me know if you have any questions.